Well, allow me to introduce our governance expert, Claude Haw, who is the leader in strategy, governance, leadership development practice at Business Sherpa Group, where he works with the not-for-profit sector. He's also president of Venture Coaches, a private management consulting and investment company. Claude has led the governance review of our organization. We're joined also by Morris Flewwelling, is a fellow of the CMA. His reputation as a leader in heritage preservation has been enhanced through his long service to many organizations. He has provided valuable guidance, both as a leader and volunteer, to countless heritage organizations, including the Alberta Museums Association, the Canadian Museums Association, the Canadian Nature Federation, and the Canadian Federation of Friends of Museums. Morris is a champion of best practice in governance based on his extensive experience as a director, and he's participated in the current review of our bylaws. So let's begin with you, Morris, if you don't mind. Morris will discuss the role of the board with respect to setting policy, setting budget, approving plans, and supervising the executive director, all fundamental requirements. Morris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jack, for the opportunity briefly to address the Assembly today. I understand that a review of the bylaws was included in the strategic plan and requested at the last AGM. When the call went out to the CMA Fellows for volunteers to assist the Bylaw Review Committee, I offered to help since I have worked with nonprofit boards in the public school and museum sectors and have 21 years of municipal experience in leadership. Also, the project was given strong leadership and direction from Claude, who has huge experience and skill in the areas of bylaws and governance. Bylaws are the framework to describe how an organization will work. A good set of bylaws should outline the organizational structure and encourage membership engagement. Good bylaws ensure fairness, equitability, and transparency of operation. They support leadership and encourage delegation, as well as providing for elegant management of the operations. Good bylaws put actions to vision and support good planning. It seemed appropriate to me at this special meeting to discuss and adopt a new set of bylaws that it might be well to review the roles and responsibilities of directors, officers, and management. This material will not be new to most of you, but bears repeating and reminding as we collectively set about in this meeting to receive a new set of revised bylaws. This information is well set out, by the way, in the CMA governance document, but here I want just to emphasize in simplicity the four key responsibilities of directors. They are: 1, to set and approve the budget. The document is usually drafted for the board's consideration by the Finance Committee and the Executive Director. Number 2, to set the policies of the operations. Policies are the rules and regulations under which management operates and which guide decision-making of the board. 3, to set the plans of the organization. Collectively, the board adopts plans for all aspects of its programs and operations. And 4, to supervise the single employee of the board, that is, the executive director. A basic caution here is that the board should work at a policy and governance level and not get tangled and involved in the issues of management. Directors have several duties, and these will include the duty to be informed. You must know what's going on. The duty to support the purposes and aims of the organization. You have to be with the organization. The duty of maintaining confidentiality of sensitive material, and the duty of care to act as might be expected from a prudent individual. Thanks for the opportunity to speak today and to serve as a volunteer member of the Bylaws Review Committee. Back to you, Jack.
Thank you very much, Morris. That's really helpful. And I appreciate your strong insights into governance. And now let's turn to Claude. And Claude will now discuss in depth the best practices in governance and provide you with some useful tips and guidance for you and your institution. Over to you, Claude.
Thank you, Jack. Good afternoon, everyone. It's been my pleasure to work with the senior team and board of directors at CMA to complete the governance review. Morris contributed extensive knowledge, experience, and wisdom to the exercise. So thank you very much, Morris. Next slide, please. For those members interested in general guidance on governance best practices, this presentation includes a few thoughts about board responsibilities and efficient board operations. Each organization is unique, but most governance principles can be applied quite generally. Next slide. The purpose of governance is to ensure, usually on behalf of others, that an organization achieves what it should achieve while avoiding those behaviors and situations that should be avoided. It all sounds rather simple, doesn't it? Next slide. Morris actually covered most of the items on this slide. The role of the board is fairly straightforward and focused on those items that, that Morris talked about. I'm going to expand on some of those. Best practices in corporate governance today is really a mix of legislated obligations and striving for efficient operations by looking at best practices or practices that work in other organizations. Next slide. So fairly similar to those points that Morris brought up, the board main responsibility is to act as the steward of the corporation. That includes such things as the strategic planning process, looking at what risks are threatening or possibly threatening to the organization and having appropriate mitigation strategies in place, having succession planning in place for both the senior management, and in this case, the executive director, but also for the board of directors. The board is also responsible overall for the communications policy for the corporation. Communications leads, appropriate communication leads to trust from the members, but it also leads to good reputation overall for the corporation and many of the facets of the business. And finally, management information and financial controls. That's the broad remit of the board. Going to the next slide, talking about some of the specific duties that a board member has and boards in general. Each individual board member has a fiduciary duty to the corporation. That means a number of things. It requires that each director act honestly and in good faith and in the best interests of the corporation. There's a duty of confidentiality. A director should not disclose confidential information about the corporation without the full knowledge of the board and where it makes sense to disclose that information. There's a duty to disclose, on the other hand, where each director must share information that's germane to the corporation that they become aware of. Finally, breaching this fiduciary duty carries significant ramifications, and irreconcilable differences may result or should result in resignation of the director. Often that's sufficient to resolve the situation. Next slide. Diving a little bit deeper on conflict of interest, this should be covered well in the board mandate document, and that includes a description of the key duties and responsibilities of the board as a whole, as well as individual board members. Conflict of interest guidelines should either be included in this document or attached as an appendix. Many real, perceived, or potential conflicts can arise, and they should be managed immediately and effectively. Next slide. Duty of care means that each director must exercise the care, diligence, and skill that a reasonably prudent person would exercise in comparable circumstances. This requires spending the time necessary to make an informed business judgment. A director must apply whatever knowledge, education, and experience that they have to the business and affairs of the corporation. When particular skills or expertise is required that the directors do not possess, they should seek out that experience and expertise from others outside of the board. All directors have the same duty of care. Next slide. One of the requirements of the board is that effort go into the succession planning. And it is recommended that each board of directors be large enough to have sufficient expertise and general experience, while also often addressing any need for geographic or sectoral representation. But I would caution that boards should be no larger than necessary. Smaller boards make it easier to schedule meetings, achieve quorum, and to make decisions. Several years ago, I served on a board of 26 people, and it was completely dysfunctional. Not completely because of size, but size was a significant factor. I was able to assist the organization to reduce the board to 15 members, and in my humble opinion, it was still too big. Next slide. Board diversity is very, very important for a strong board operation. Organizations should consider bringing experts from outside the sector as well, so that board discussions are wholesome and consider any issue from a number of perspectives. Next slide. Diving a little bit deeper into operations, board meetings should be scheduled as far in advance as possible. And best practice is generally to schedule a full year in advance. Notice and agenda should be provided to board members at least 1 week in advance, except for emergency meetings. And hopefully you don't have too many of those. Routine committee and management reports should be provided in written form at least 48 hours in advance of the meeting. Each report should indicate if it is for information only or a board decision is required. You should consider the use of a consent agenda where routine items for information only are not normally requiring any discussion can be approved in a single motion without extensive discussion. You should also consider having a declaration of conflict agenda item at the start of all meetings to reinforce that all board members are required to identify any real, potential, or perceived conflict of interest. And finally, consider ending your meeting with an in-camera section. This allows the board to meet without management present to discuss any items of a sensitive nature, but also leads to better board operation because board members are talking about how to improve the board, the operation of the board going forward. Next slide. One of the fundamental things that boards have to do is make decisions. All board members should participate in decision-making, and whenever possible, decisions should be by consensus. If a major decision is being made, it may be helpful to have a vote by show of hands. Anyone with a conflict of interest should not participate in the discussions or voting. Meeting minutes should capture the date, location, members in attendance, and decisions made. Minutes should show if any vote is unanimous and if anyone declares a conflict of interest. All board members are bound by a board decision, whether or not they have voted in favor of the decision. And often I've seen board members feel that if they voted against something, they don't have to support it. In fact, that's not the case. Any board decision binds everyone to that decision. Next slide. A few other recommendations. An institution's board mandate document should include a description of the key duties and responsibilities of the board as a whole, as well as individual board members. Conflict of interest guidelines should either be included or attached as an appendix, as I mentioned earlier. Each standing committee should also have a terms of reference document, which includes a description of the key duties and responsibilities of the committee and how the work of the committee is brought to the board for review, ratification, or approval. All organizations should complete a detailed strategic planning exercise every 3 or 4 years, and the board has the responsibility to ensure that this happens. The board's involvement can range from approving the final plan to being actively involved in the strategic planning process. The board should assess the organization against the approved strategic plan at least annually. Finally, review and approval of the annual operating plan together with a budget for the year is a good way for the board to oversee and track the performance of the organization through the year. Next slide. The board should also complete a simplified annual self-assessment of board operations. This can be done with an online survey of all board members. Management and the board should identify the skills, expertise, and experience that would lead to the best overall board performance. Historically, and as well as organizational performance. Historically, boards were comprised of too many like-minded individuals, which led to a congenial atmosphere, but often did not yield the best results overall for the organization. Best practice today is to have a board that is diverse, at least to the degree that the organization members are diverse. All organizations should provide a live, in-person or online orientation session for all board members to welcome them to the organization and provide sufficient information for them to hit the ground running. All current and past board materials should be available online in a secure repository accessible for all board members. Next slide. An annual performance review of the senior person in the organization, the CEO or the executive director, as well as the senior team, is important for any robust organization. Many organizations do not have an emergency succession plan in place, but this is considered best practice today. Next slide. I'll end with the board member code, and it really summarizes all of the things that I talked about. The board members should be focused on managing the business and affairs of the corporation, typically through the CEO or executive director. The board should function as a trustee and a consultant to the team. All board members should take the job seriously and devote the effort to do it well and to do what is right. They should support those who are worthy. In other words, seeking out leadership to help in satisfying the needs of the organization. They should use board routines and infrastructure to make sure that things are running smoothly. They should always ask for the information that they need to make a decision. They should build relationships with their other board members and, if necessary, rock the boat. By that meaning dissent during a meeting if you disagree with the decision or direction, but when a decision is made, be bound by that decision. Next slide. So in closing, I believe that with the changes being put forward, the CMA is in a strong position from a governance point of view. I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. My contact information is there, and I think we may have time for a couple of questions as well. So back to you, Jack.
Thank you so much, Claude. That was wonderful. So let's have a question and answer session with Claude and Morris. And I would ask that you please pose your questions through the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. Please note that we'll try and answer as many questions as possible. And we have Kyle and Linda ready on standby to read out any questions.
Hello. Yes, I'd like to start with a question that we got quite a few times. It's a bit more of a technical question than anything else. A number of people are wondering whether the slides will be shared with participants and available as a PDF. And I have a question as well saying, are these sessions recorded and shared with members? And that would be great.
Thank you very much, Kyle. Of course, we're going to make these slides available. We can all profit from the information in them. And yes, we are recording the session. And I thank you for mentioning it. I should have said that right at the beginning. Thank you very much. Claude, is that all right, by the way? I said
Yes, yes,
Thank
absolutely.
you. Thanks
No
so
problem.
much.
Okay, for our next question, we have a question from Sarah Peru. What are the main challenges your board faces?
That's for Jack, I assume?
I'm very happy to answer that, but I've also deferred to my other board members here. I'd say our principal issue right now is, I mean, clearly we're all in this period of survival, if you like. And I would say financial survival is critical. But let me just say, for the board itself, the issues of diversity, social justice, inclusion, are hugely important that we set ourselves up. And this is one of the reasons for having a special general meeting. And clearly helping and supporting all the museums, speaking up for all the museums across the whole of Canada right now is an ongoing, not so much an issue, but it's a challenge and it's a responsibility we take very seriously. So I would say perhaps those three areas, all very, very critical right now. It's not easy for anybody, and clearly there are health and well-being issues in many areas and right across our sector. Clearly the challenges of these big global issues that we're facing. But in terms of the board, I think those three areas. Thank you.
We have a question from Carol Mayer. Could you expand? Could you expand a little on conflict of interest? Examples, perhaps.
Claude, are you Morris?
Sure. Yeah, I don't mind stepping in on that. I mean, there are so many places where you can get into a conflict. You know, some kind of gross conflict or significant conflict situations are where maybe an organization is where you're on the board is doing business with another organization that you somehow have a vested interest in the success of, maybe financial reasons why you want that to continue to work. That puts you in a conflict situation. Let's say you are part of an organization that is supplying something to the organization that you're on a board, where you're on the board. That's a clear conflict of interest. That doesn't mean that you necessarily have to step off the board, but anytime there's any discussion about the relationship with that other outside group, you need to recuse yourself and not be seen to be trying to convince your other board members to support it and that sort of thing. So that would be an example. There's lots of types of conflict, and the fact, the one that's most difficult is where there's a perceived conflict. So where if I'm on the board of an organization, but I've also got a services organization that is trying to sell those services, that's pretty obvious that there's a conflict potential there, and that you should take proper precautions around that. It may mean stepping off the board. Where there are, it's more gray zone, if you will, or somebody says, well, you're in conflict on that. You know, you have to kind of step back and look at why would they see it as a conflict? Maybe something that you didn't really consider a conflict is perceived to be a conflict by other people. So the best way to deal with conflict is to get it out in the open and look at it from a variety of perspectives, and in the end, do what is right for the organization. And that may very well mean stepping off the board.
Thank you very much, Claude. Kyle, any other question that we should address? And just to remind everybody that the special general meeting is next, so stick around for the keynote address and following also the special general meeting. But Kyle, anything?
We do have more questions, so keep them coming.
Well, let's take, because this is interesting. I think we all learn from this. So I think we've got. Let's take another 2 questions if we can.
Jack, excuse me, Jack.
Yes, Morris.
Just before we go on, I support everything that Claude said about conflict of interest, whether it's actual, perceived, or potential. It seems to me that conflict of interest generally often arises around procurement issues, where someone is seen as benefiting financially from something that they have an opportunity to vote on. And the other one is around the issues of nepotism, where members of family get involved. And federally, you've just seen a couple of examples of this. So I just add those 2 as examples. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Morris. That's very, very helpful. Kyle, back to you.
Yes. Joan Kennigan is asking, can you expand on what you mean by all directors having the same duty of care?
Yeah, this is, I guess the bottom line on all of this is, as a director, you have all of these same responsibilities. And that means that, you know, as an example, if you decide you don't need to read the board book or the board materials in advance of the meeting because 2 other board members always come so well prepared, you're not really satisfying your duty as a board member. It's expected that you will show up prepared, and that's why there are certain operational best practices to make sure that board members have every opportunity to show up prepared, by not hitting them with a 200-page document to read minutes before the board meeting. You know, making sure that the board materials are available well enough in advance that you have time to scrutinize them and think about the questions that you're going to pose about that, to maybe things that are missing or things that you didn't understand or whatever. So, you know, all members have the duty of care, regardless of what's happening with their other board members, the other members on the board. I think there's also the whole issue of, you know, and that's why I have a whole slide on making decisions. Boards are all about making decisions for the organization, making often fundamental decisions that can have serious impact on the life and longevity of the organization. So it's important that decisions be made correctly. You know, one example would be, you know, if you have an accounting, finance, and risk committee, like this organization does, that you have at least a couple of board members who are financially literate, or, you know, and have expertise in accounting practices and that sort of thing. Doesn't mean they have to be, you know, a practicing accountant, et cetera, but they have to be literate enough when it comes to financial matters to be able to assess that the information is complete and accurate and that sort of thing. That doesn't mean that everybody on the board has to have that same level of financial expertise. You want to make sure you have some of that. But at the end of the day, all board members are responsible for the decisions being made. So you want to make sure that you have the right expertise at the table.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. Kyle.
Moi, j'ai une question, c'est
Oh
Linda.
oui,
J'ai une
merci.
question de
I have a question from Philippe Dubé, who was wondering, the question here is to know whether the board of directors should represent the members of the association or the society in which this association is.
Merci, Linda.
Thank you, Linda.
Claude Morris.
Claude Morris?
Sorry, I didn't get the translation of that. I apologize. I seem to be on the wrong channel.
Okay. Philippe Dubé is wondering if the board of directors represent the members of the association or the society in which that member lives in.
Yeah, so the board is responsible to the organization. Board members are there to ensure the health and longevity of the organization. That is their primary responsibility. To do that, to be able to look after the organization, of course, if it's a member organization, you have to meet the needs of the members or you won't have longevity for the organization. So you have to also make sure that staff, the employees, are properly cared for, or again, you won't have longevity in the organization. So the board member's responsibility is broad and complete. The fundamental responsibility is to the longevity of the organization, but that comes with it, looking after all of the key stakeholders that dictate the success or failure of the organization. Hopefully that helps.
Gosh, that's a difficult one. It was a very interesting question. I think in the interests of keeping the show on the road, so to speak, I'm going to, Kyle, well, there are a lot of questions unanswered because maybe perhaps we could respond via the website, and I'm conscious of that if we were...
I think that would be best. There are quite a few questions here.
I think it would be useful. I think we've all learned a lot from this. Thank you so much, Claude and Morris. If we could, Kyle, if we could see these questions put up on the website with, if we could ask Claude and Morris to help respond to them, I think we'll all benefit from this. And thank you to everybody for the questions you asked. I'm now going to turn to the special general meeting. And so stick around for that and for the way forward immediately afterwards.